Well, London, in some sense, is already a bit of a 24-hour city. You only need to be driving around the West End on weekends to see 3 a.m. in the morning. It's still buzzing with people. And certainly from a safety point of view, it probably will be welcomed by some. Because when you go out at night, you have the choice of taking a taxi back home if you do not drive. Sometimes that can be a bit more expensive. So it's an interesting idea. The flip side is there's some people who would oppose this because of the loss of jobs, and we're seeing the RMT unions. But more interesting is the bid by Amazon to turn the old ticket offices into Amazon lockers. Which
smart move?
Smart move, make some money for Transport for London. Perhaps that might help compensate for the job loss. But I think it's a smart move, and I think it's also a reflection of the times. People want to do things on the go. So if you can pick up your stuff from Amazon on your way to work or on your way from work, that's probably quite a good idea.
That's interesting too, because they seem to be doing a lot of focus on the tube. Obviously, it's the 150th year, etc. But I was reading a supermarket chain here in Britain is trialling out, I think, 5 different stations where you can click and collect. So you can be at work, order your veggies, your vegetables, and they will be delivered at a certain time frame to the tube station. You can pick them up on the way home.
Exactly.
It really is
the daily one-stop shop for everything, really. So we'll see how this works out. 2015.
In terms of the 24 hours, though, and the nightlife and the night economy, that 24, it'd be interesting to see if they can actually put eventually put a figure on it. What it generates for the City of London.
Certainly, and I think that possibly would be one of the interesting cases when you then come to negotiate with the unions about what the long-term impact of this would be from an economic point of view. Interesting point.
I have to say, as a Londoner, though, don't you think there is something quite romantic about that last mad dash for the last tube on a Friday or Saturday night?
Would everyone say that, though?
That's true. Okay, let's move on, Aaron. We're going to
talk
about
the
Figaro. Germany and a minimum wage.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because Angela Merkel and her party, and correct me if I'm wrong, had always been opposed.
They'd been opposed to it, but they'd actually said they would prefer an approach that was tailored to specific regions or an industry rather than a national minimum wage. But they're being forced...
So, sorry, a regional minimum wage,
a regional and an industry sort of base minimum wage. That was the initial stance. So this seems to be that they're now willing to compromise because they need to form a coalition government post the September elections. The question is how much support is there within the Christian Democrats, Merkel's party, for this. But it seems like they will eventually settle on some wage. There will be concerns, obviously, about competitiveness for industry in terms of wages. But when you compare that to a country like Britain, I think in Britain it's about the equivalent of €7.50 an hour. That's still lower than Germany's proposed €8.50 an hour. But I think implementation will be key.
Why has Angela Merkel always had an ideological opposition to national minimum wage?
Well, I think if you look at sort of her economic ideology, so to speak, it's lent generally towards the free market. And the idea that you should impose a blanket minimum wage across all of Germany, which we know from an economic historical perspective, East Germany and West Germany had different economic DNAs. So her much more tailored approach seemed to be a bit more of a middle ground in terms of her economic thinking. But I think now, from a political point of view, it seems politically expedient to come to some sort of compromise with the left.
But that's interesting because, she talks about, you mentioned the open market. I mean, the United States, very, very open market. It's got a minimum wage here in Britain. I mean, are there pros and cons to an economy by having or not having a minimum wage?
Well, the idea of the minimum wage is that you provide for fairness in the workplace. But the flip side is the danger that those who should actually be on a higher wage would then be put on a minimum wage. So that might actually have some unintended consequences. And I think time will tell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Daniela, should we go on to, what was it, the farm?
China and the EU, I think we're looking at next.
Okay.
Trade talks there. I didn't know that they were rowing. What have they been rowing over?
It's more trade spats, isn't it? One of the big ones is solar panels.
Solar panels, steel, wine. This is all about the
wine,
the proposed anti-subsidy tariffs that the EU wanted to impose on the imports of Chinese solar panels into the EU. But now it seems that both blocs will now be talking about some sort of deal.
Isn't it, really?
Interesting because, the EU is China's biggest trade partner, and China's the EU's biggest trade partner after the US, and both sides want to increase trade.
Both sides need each other.
They need each other, essentially, but I don't think we'll see a real solid trade deal for another couple of years.
But the history of the trade spats, I always come back to, well, typically the EU accusing China and certain industry of dumping their goods, flooding the European market.
But it's also about access to markets for both sides, because potentially both sides have a lot to gain from having a mutually beneficial trade agreement. Yeah.
This Ukraine story is absolutely fascinating, and yesterday on BBC World News we had Yulia Tymoshenko's daughter explaining to us what's been going on there with this vote. This idea of Ukraine dumping Europe and looking towards Russia, why now?
Well, it's an interesting one, and some people would say this is a political victory for Putin, but my question is it really in the long term? Is this an attempt, is this a much more hidden sign of weakness? Now, Russia is proposing tripartite talks instead, so let's all sit at the table. But from a Ukrainian perspective, economically, remember what happened in 2009, Russia blocking off gas supplies and turning off the taps, increased prices. Now, Russia has also placed pressure in terms of banning exports and imposing stricter customs control on Ukraine. So Ukraine's hand has been forced a bit. Now, the question is, does this jeopardize Ukraine's future in the European Union? I think potentially only time will tell, but it's quite an interesting course of events.
Are we going to talk about it's in the Financial Times, the scandals? The scandal, these chat rooms, that when we talk about this LIBOR, rate rigging scandal, we've got one ongoing at the moment, the Forex, the International Foreign Currency Exchange. There's talk and allegations of that's been rigged or at least manipulated. And this is about what? These are chat rooms where...
These chat rooms have been actually at the heart of the investigation as well over the LIBOR rigging scandal. And when you think about the fact that now what we have 3.7 billion already in fines paid, banks are being told to make more legal financial provision. I think basically they're trying to look internally and see areas which they can close potential loopholes. So the proposal is, rather than these multilateral chat rooms, that we move to bilateral chat rooms, which might allow for greater regulation of what traders are doing.